The winter air over Oslo is sharp, cold, and unmistakably northern. The tarmac of the Norwegian capital's airport gleams under a pale sun as the aircraft door opens. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy steps out first, his familiar olive-coloured jacket visible even from afar, followed closely by his wife, Olena Zelenska. They descend the stairs to the waiting line of Norwegian officials led by Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre. There's warmth in the handshake, but beneath it lies a moment of immense geopolitical weight. Because this visit isn't just a routine bilateral meeting, it's a signal of a potential turning point in Europe's most devastating war since 1945. For months, the conflict in Ukraine has settled into a deadly rhythm. The front line stretches more than 1,000 kilometers from Kherson to the outskirts of Kharkiv, frozen in its own kind of stalemate. Thousands of artillery shells still fall each day, but the territorial maps barely move. And it's against this grim backdrop that a new proposal has begun to circulate, one first voiced by US President Donald Trump. His idea: freeze the battle where it stands and use the current front line as the foundation for negotiations with Russia. As cameras follow Zelenskyy's arrival in Oslo, the question hovering over the meeting is clear. Will Ukraine's leader, once staunchly opposed to any talks that legitimize Russian occupation, now consider this as a starting point? Moments later, Zelenskyy and Støre stand side by side for the national anthems. The brass band plays solemnly. Norwegian soldiers present arms. Ukrainian flags ripple beside Nordic ones. The symbolism is unmistakable, two nations aligned by principle, but now perhaps also by pragmatism. Inside the Prime Minister's office, the atmosphere is serious. Behind closed doors, discussions stretch for hours. And when Zelenskyy finally emerges before reporters, his tone carries both fatigue and clarity. He speaks in English, his voice steady yet reflective. The most important details, he begins, are how to defend ourselves, how to have unity and security guarantees, and the place of the United States, which is important in security guarantees for the future of Ukraine, and how now to go into political decisions, I mean peace negotiations, a diplomatic way to stop Putin. It's a remarkable statement. For a man who for years rejected any ceasefire that would leave Russian troops inside Ukrainian borders, Zelenskyy is now acknowledging diplomacy as a viable, even necessary path. He continues, recalling his conversation with President Trump. After our conversation, you saw public messages from Trump, he says. He proposed, stay where we stay and begin conversation. I think that was a good compromise, but I'm not sure that Putin will support it, and I said it to the president. The phrasing, a good compromise, quickly reverberates across global headlines. For the first time, Zelenskyy publicly supports, at least in principle, a peace framework shaped by Washington rather than Kyiv. The idea is simple yet seismic. Both armies hold their current positions, the shooting stops and talks begin from there. But the implications are complex. To many Ukrainians, the current front line isn't just a battlefield boundary, it's a scar that cuts through their country. Entire cities like Mariupol and Melitopol remain under Russian control. Millions have fled from those regions. Would freezing the war there mean conceding them forever? Zelenskyy doesn't directly answer that question, but his words show a man balancing between realism and resistance. He knows his army is exhausted. He knows Western aid, once a torrent, has slowed to a trickle amid political gridlock in Washington and fatigue in Europe. He also knows that every week Russia produces more drones, more missiles, more shells than Ukraine can shoot down or fire back. Still, he frames his support carefully, not surrender, but strategy. He emphasizes that peace talks must come with security guarantees, a phrase that signals a permanent US role in protecting Ukraine, possibly modeled after post-war agreements like those once given to South Korea or Israel. The Oslo setting reinforces that message. Norway has been one of Kyiv's most consistent supporters, sending billions in military and humanitarian aid since the invasion began in 2022. Støre's government has even pledged multi-year funding, giving Ukraine something few others have: predictability. As the two leaders sit down for bilateral talks, Norwegian officials nod attentively. Behind them, aides flip through briefing folders, while television cameras capture the quiet choreography of diplomacy. Both delegations speak of unity, security, and long-term support. But the real focus, as everyone knows, is the Trump proposal. In Washington, the former president's idea has stirred both hope and controversy. Trump, now back in the White House, argues that an immediate ceasefire along the existing front line could save lives and open the door to what he calls a fair deal for both sides. Critics, however, warn that such a deal could reward aggression, effectively granting Russia control over roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, and the land corridor to Crimea. Yet for Zelensky, standing in Oslo, the calculus is shifting. Ukraine's counteroffensives have stalled, Western support wavers, and the winter ahead threatens to deepen the humanitarian crisis. The question is no longer whether to talk, but how to talk without losing the very sovereignty for which Ukrainians have fought so fiercely. In his remarks, Zelensky stresses that the role of the United States remains essential, a line clearly meant to reassure both Washington and his own people that Ukraine would not negotiate alone. He praises Norway for its consistency and says pointedly, security guarantees for the future of Ukraine are not just about today's war. They are about preventing the next one. Outside the press hall, Ukrainian and Norwegian flags flutter in the icy wind. The Oslo skyline glows faintly through the mist, a quiet contrast to the thunder of artillery hundreds of kilometers away in Donetsk. For analysts, Zelensky's endorsement of Trump's proposal, however cautious, marks a possible inflection point in the 2.5-year war. It doesn't mean peace is near, but it suggests that even Kyiv's most determined voices are now entertaining ideas once deemed politically untouchable. Back in Kyiv, reactions are mixed. Some lawmakers praise the president's pragmatism, saying that real leadership is knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Others fear a slippery slope toward partition. Among ordinary Ukrainians, the mood is conflicted, relief at the idea of ending the bloodshed, tempered by resentment at the thought of ceding land soaked in their soldiers' blood. Russian officials, meanwhile, respond with the familiar blend of caution and cynicism. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Moscow takes note of Trump's idea, but insists that any negotiations must recognize the new realities on the ground. Kremlin code for acknowledging Russia's annexations. Putin himself remains silent publicly, but state television hails the American proposal as a step toward realism. For Trump, the plan offers both political and diplomatic dividends. He can claim to be fulfilling his promise to end the war in 24 hours while testing his new administration's ability to broker a high-stakes global deal. For Ukraine, the risk is enormous, but so is the opportunity. If managed carefully, negotiations could secure a genuine ceasefire and open channels for reconstruction aid, prisoner exchanges, and the return of deported children. If mishandled, they could freeze Ukraine's divisions permanently and embolden Moscow to strike again later. Inside Ukraine's military command, generals weigh these scenarios soberly. The line between tactical pause and strategic defeat has never been thinner. The men and women in trenches around Bakhmut and Zaporizhzhia have little patience for diplomacy. To them, every day of holding the line feels like survival itself, yet even they acknowledge that the war's momentum has shifted and that endurance alone may not deliver victory. Back in Oslo, Zelensky closes his statement with an understated but telling line. That's why we had a long conversation, he says, about how to make political decisions. I mean, peace negotiations, a diplomatic way to stop Putin. He doesn't promise success, he doesn't predict timelines, but he signals unmistakably that the door to diplomacy is now open. When the meeting ends, the Ukrainian and Norwegian delegations file out into the cold evening. Zelensky and Støre share a final handshake before cameras. Their expressions are serious, almost somber. The moment captures the contradiction at the heart of this new phase, the search for peace conducted under the shadow of ongoing war. Later that night, Norwegian broadcasters replay the footage on loop, Zelensky stepping off the plane, his remarks about unity and security guarantees, his acknowledgement of Trump's plan. Analysts debate whether this is pragmatism or pressure, a move of strength or surrender. For Kyiv, the challenge now is managing perception as much as policy. Zelensky must convince allies that exploring negotiations doesn't mean abandoning resistance. He must reassure Ukrainians that peace talks are not capitulation, and he must ensure that the West, particularly the United States, stays engaged long enough to make any agreement credible. Behind the scenes, diplomats begin drafting frameworks, how to verify ceasefire lines, how to monitor withdrawals, how to guarantee civilian safety in contested zones. Names like OSCE, NATO liaison missions and UN observers circulate again, institutions once dismissed as too slow for this kind of war. Meanwhile, Moscow tests the narrative. Propaganda outlets claim Ukraine is ready to recognize realities. But Zelensky's words, if read carefully, say something subtler. Not recognition of defeat, but recognition of limits and of the need to translate battlefield resilience into political leverage. The Oslo visit thus becomes more than just another diplomatic stop. It's a snapshot of a leader adapting to the war's new rhythm, balancing defiance with diplomacy, pride with pragmatism. It also reflects a global shift. After nearly 3 years of relentless fighting, even staunch allies now talk of endgames, not victories. In Washington, the Trump administration seizes on Zelensky's remarks as validation. The president's peace vision is gaining traction, one senior official tells reporters. We believe it's time to turn battlefield courage into diplomatic progress. Yet others inside the Pentagon warn privately that any premature ceasefire could leave Ukraine vulnerable, especially if Russia uses the pause to rearm. European capitals watch closely. Paris and Berlin issue cautious statements supporting any initiative that leads to a just peace. Warsaw and Vilnius, by contrast, express concern, arguing that freezing the conflict rewards aggression. The divide highlights a broader truth. Europe's unity on Ukraine remains strong in principle, but increasingly fragile in practice. As dawn breaks over Oslo the next morning, Zelensky's motorcade heads back to the airport. The visit has lasted less than 24 hours, but its political echoes will last far longer. Reporters shout questions. Mr. President, do you trust President Trump's plan? Zelensky pauses briefly before boarding. He doesn't answer directly. Jonas says, every step toward peace must protect our people. The engines roar, the plane lifts off, and within moments it disappears into the grey Scandinavian sky. Back in Kyiv, government spokespeople clarify that Ukraine is not yet entering talks, but is open to discussing frameworks that lead to peace with justice. Privately, however, advisers admit that discussions with Washington are already underway, quietly, carefully and conditionally. On the ground, the war continues. Sirens wail in Kharkiv. Shells fall near Avdiivka. The humanitarian cost mounts. But for the first time in months, a diplomatic horizon, however faint, is visible. In that sense, Zelensky's Oslo statement may prove historic, not because it ended the war, but because it began to redefine what ending the war might look like. As one European diplomat puts it later, he didn't say peace at any price. He said peace with guarantees. That's the difference, and maybe the start of something real. And so, as the world weighs Trump's proposal, Zelensky's cautious support, and Putin's silence, the contours of the next phase in this long war begin to emerge. A phase not defined solely by tanks and trenches, but by words, trust, and the fragile possibility of compromise. Because in the end, as Zelensky himself put it, diplomacy is not surrender, it is strategy. And sometimes it is the only way to stop the killing without losing the cause.